Okay, I'm going to start. We're on page 182. We might finish this packet today, but it's unlikely. We might. And we're going to plow right forward. Forgive the pun, the word plow. Plowing will become important today. We're going to dig new ground, too. Is that... Did I say that correctly? Break new ground. Yeah, break new ground. I'm going to plow forward, break new ground.
You have to give an attribution because there's a copyright.
You're right, exactly. Okay, so page 182, verse 6. And we're going back to the question of when you're supposed to tithe. So at what point in the production of your produce are you supposed to tithe? I want to say just what we dealt with very briefly last week was the comparison. It's an interesting comparison. I think some people occasionally will take offense at the comparison, but it's also an interesting comparison to me. They were comparing the laws for taking care of your animals, your farm animals, and also your workers, and deriving some of the responsibilities that owners have from one or the other. So just as you're not allowed to do X, Y, Z to an animal, a beast of burden, you're not allowed to do it to a human being. And so the idea of comparing human beings and beasts of burden, farm animals, can be offensive. But it's also interesting if you take a step back, and we're going to, I think, get back to it in a little while. I think maybe even today. But what they're really doing is kind of probing the sources of these ideas. I mean, beyond the Torah. So, the Torah actually has explicit instructions on how to take care of your animals, and it has explicit instructions on how to take care of your workers. But taking a step back, you wonder, so what's behind this? There's a basic ethics that's behind it. The landowner has to take care of the things, the people that are working for him, for her. What ways do we take care of our animals? What ways do we take care of human beings, and why? The why is interesting also. And once you start to compare, I think you actually get some interesting issues come up. So we'll get to that. So they're taking a quick break on that now. I'm not sure why. And going back to the issue of when you're supposed to tithe. Okay, so I'm gonna start there, page 182, verse 6. Metiv Mar Zutra. So Mar Zutra brings an objection. So what we've had before, if you remember, basically two opinions. So one is you tithe when the produce is brought to the house, and one is the courtyard. And they're almost the same thing. I mean, they end up combining those two. Well, the courtyard is basically a house. It's the opening of the house. So, so I'm going to keep going. Ezehu Gornan L'Masarot. Yes.
What standing does Mar Zutra have? Is it Mr. Zutra?
Mar is the master. Yeah, so my modern Hebrew is Mr., but it's Mar is master.
And how does he compare to rabbis?
Oh, I see. So it's interesting. The fact that he's Mar Zutra means he was never ordained as a rabbi. And there are people that aren't ordained that actually contribute to the discussions, and they have standing. They have authority. The most famous is Shmuel, who was the light of his generation, who was not a rabbi. He's just called Shmuel. But there's actually several others: Ben Azai, Ben Zoma. Not everybody, but there are people that aren't rabbis that participate in the discussions, and in the case of Shmuel, became totally authoritative. For some of them, there's stories about why they never actually end up being ordained. Why they didn't finish the process. It's like today, you have to take a test, and you have to stand before a committee, and for whatever reason they didn't do it. It doesn't take away from their scholarship, though. On their fine minds. So, good question. All right. Ezehu Gornan L'Masarot. If you look at the literal translation and notice how different it is from the translation and commentary, so it just says, what time do you start tithing? So that literal translation means, so is it when you bring it into the house? Is it when you bring it into the courtyard? So when do you start tithing? But the word goren or gornan actually means the threshing floor. And so the question actually means, and here it's referring to grain, and it opens our eyes to those of us that aren't farmers to different types of produce. So there's a type of produce that you take to the market right away. You pick apples off the tree, and you can take it to the market. But grains, right, there's more you're going to do with the grains probably before you take them to there's processing, right, yeah, maybe you're going to make flour out of it. Maybe you're going to actually bake bread out of it. It's just picking it. You could, I mean, but you could just pick it and heat and have it in a pile. But most farmers that farm for a living aren't going to do that, and it's not something you can eat right away. So let's like roughly divide the world of produce into two. One is that there's almost no work other than picking. So the end of the work really is picking, and there's also where picking is actually only the beginning. There's a whole bunch of other stuff you have to do. And I suppose there's some things in between. Actually, they're going to get to a couple things in between too. All right. Anyway, so when they say ezu gornam lamasrot, they're already sort of giving away. The goren is the threshing floor. What happens at a threshing floor is a kind of separation of the grains. And I've never been to a threshing floor. Anybody been to a threshing floor before? I mean, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Right. But they're using the word there not as threshing floor specifically. It's an idiomatic expression that just means, I think Steinsaltz has a good in the commentary, at what point in the production does it become liable for tithing? And in this discussion before, we talked about it's important because, first of all, it's important just economically. That's the 10%. But there's produce that's not going to be of any value to you before the threshing process because you're going to discover that it's just not good or it's going to rot on the way to the threshing floor, and you don't want to have to pay tithe on that. But really, once you've threshed it, once it's made it to the threshing floor, you're actually making that distinction that this is profitable stuff. This is stuff I can eat, stuff I can sell. Okay. So and what we're going to get now is just a different opinion. Okay, it's not just a different opinion. You'll see it's a different conceptual approach, and I can give it away right now just by saying the earlier is an issue of geography. It becomes liable for tithing when it reaches the house, the threshing floor, which is in the house, or the courtyard, which has the threshing floor. So that's just a question of geography. You're taking it out of the field, and now it's someplace else. There's other ways of looking at it. For instance, bekishuin uvediluin, when it comes to gourds and squash. I was going to say pumpkin. Modern Hebrew dalad is pumpkin, but any kind of gourd, any kind of squash. Meshi pasku. So when you're done with them. So when you're done with them, it means that you trim them. Whatever that means. I mean, I've never picked gourds before. Have you? I don't know. I've never picked them before. I've been to pumpkin fields in New England. It's really very beautiful at the end in the fall. Pumpkin fields, and they grow kind of, but once you pick them, you have to do something to them before anybody's going to buy them or before you can eat them, and it's called trimming. Were you going to say what it is?
I was going to just say the stem. You just make sure that it was like 1 inch or something. Sure. Whatever the thing is for the stem.
Yeah.
That's where you cut it off.
Yeah. Right. So once you do that, then you're liable to tithe it. So it's not a question of a location here. You could do that in the field, wherever you feel like doing it. Maybe you would do it in the field because you got your farm workers there. Okay. So that's very different than when you bring it to the house. Okay. Ve'amar Rabbi Asi, and Rabbi Asi kind of adds to this, Meshinatel pikas shalahem. So when there's some blossoms that wither before you sell them, and you remove those withered blossoms. So there's just some removing of some trimming, some extra work. So it's when the work is done, and that's a pumpkin that you can now sell. Doesn't matter where it is. At that point, it's liable for tithing. Are we going to have something? Yeah.
If it's a blossom that never developed into a pumpkin, then you don't have to.
Yeah. Right.
Can I get a matter of principle here?
Yeah.
Do they consider that you shouldn't be taxed on tax? In other words, if something is taxed at one level, is that subtracted from the value so that the next tax that comes along is not taxing the first tax?
So what would be an example of that? I'm not sure.
Well, state tax.
No, but for the Talmud, so I mean the tax that they pay is the tithe.
Yeah.
So what would be like a? What would be?
I mean, how many times can you tithe?
No, you only tithe once.
Well, if you do it at the earlier point before it's
And into the
cleaned
store.
up and then milled and then done again,
Yeah.
you've essentially taken the same product from its raw.
So the owner only does it once. What's at issue we talked about before is the storekeeper, once he purchases it and he's planning on selling it for profit, he also has to tithe.
So it's now been taxed twice.
It's been tithed twice, but it's two different people that are paying the tax.
But are they
It's ownership
tithing the
rather
tithe?
than
Yeah, they're tithing the tithe. Yeah, they're tithing the tithe. Yeah, because it's been tithed already by the owner. So now
they don't subtract that tithe value.
No, because it's whatever the storekeeper then ends up purchasing. Yeah,
Because the storekeeper
yeah.
didn't pay the first time.
Right.
You know, in
And-
Europe, they have a value-added tax, so that
Yeah,
each
that's exactly.
step, but you're only paying the tax on the added value, not on the same thing over and over again.
Yeah,
But you also get a
Is that
higher
true?
value.
yeah,
I think
yeah. Ron.
That's what it means.
Before we talked about tithing in the field and at home, we So in the field, we don't want to tithe necessarily because you might
Right.
from workers.
Yeah.
But this kind of tithing, I'm not quite sure why we're having this discussion, because if we tithe 10% in the raw form or tithe 10% in the cleaned up form, it's the same 10%, because if you're tithing in the raw form, you're giving some stuff that's not going to be usable. So why is it such a big deal? Why are we having
There's more value in the store. It's more valuable.
I mean, we're having a discussion because it's in the Talmud.
Why is the Talmud having this discussion?
Yes, okay.
Because it
But-
makes no difference.
Well, no, it does make a difference because they're trying to because it's really just two concepts. I mean, one is that it's yours, you can use it once you've decided and you made that decision to bring it to your house. So and then it's just, like I said, totally a geographic decision. I mean, that's the criteria. So the other criteria is when actually all the work of harvesting is done. So, you picked it, you've trimmed it, and then it's a product, and at that point. So it's just two different ways of looking at it.
My point is that if you tithe 10% when it's still the raw product, you're still giving up the same amount as if it's the clean product. There's no difference.
Oh, it might not be a difference, yeah. But the difference might be, I mean, I don't really know, but I would say that I would say it seems to me that taking it to a storehouse, you're probably going to pay less tax on that because you're going to lose some stuff along the way. So the government, look, if you're from the point of view of the government's going to get more money the sooner that you tithe it.
Okay.
Yeah, the sooner that you tithe it, and the less work you have to do to get it to the place where you're going to tithe, the government's going to get more money. The priest is going to get more, whoever gets the money.
Right.
But to me, in a way, it's logical because every member of the community has the same responsibility.
Oh, yeah.
So if the farmer tithes on the crop, he's making his contribution. The store owner has to tithe because he's also a member of the community.
Yeah.
He didn't do the farming, but he also needs to make a contribution.
You also
So
have
if
to
his
consider it
pays it all.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, look, so you could do it a different way, which is what we do, is that the farmer pays income tax on the stuff that he sells. But in some ways, he's still, it's still a double tax. And because somebody paid tax on the stuff that he bought, and he's also paying tax. So really, it's just a way of saying everybody pays taxes. I mean, it's
Correct.
right.
That's all the consumer that
Yeah.
pays there.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And the fact is that the fact that we pay sales tax doesn't take away the store owner's responsibility to pay income tax. He's paying tax, so he's paying tax on the same thing. I buy a watch and I pay sales tax. He gets some income, he pays income tax, so the government's getting tax on the same thing. But just what it means, like Martha said, is that everybody pays taxes.
But if you're vertically integrated,
Yeah.
you pay much less tax.
You
on
pay
a
much
loaf
less
of
tax.
bread.
For sure, yes. In at least in the Talmud, I'm not sure how it works here.
Well, there
Yeah.
are lots of states who don't tax.
Yeah, right.
Food.
Right. I'm sure that there were farmers that figured that out in Talmud times and told me that's why have a store? I'll just start my own store, and
Right.
and I won't have to pay taxes. I already tithed on it, and it's my fruit stand.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so I'm going to keep going. My love. Meishi pasku afilu basadeh. So it just plays out the objection is that this can happen in the field, and it conflicts with our other opinion that you don't start tithing until you get to the house or to the courtyard because this extra trimming can just take place in the field. Okay, so now they're going to wrestle with that a bit. Page 183, and so their first attempt to resolve this contradiction. So one thing they're not going to say, like I said. What I said is it's just two different approaches. But first they're going to say is that first thing they're going to say is there's no conflict here because all rabbis think alike because we're all we're all studying the same Torah and we like to agree. So it's not actually a conflict at all. You're just reading it incorrectly, and I'm going to show you how these two wonderful opinions from these wonderful rabbis harmonize, are really actually the same opinion. So it's interesting how that's always the first attempt in the Talmud is to try to harmonize opinions and to try to erase distinctions. And it rarely works, although sometimes it does. And it's interesting psychologically to analyze why they felt like that was the first thing you have to try to do, is to try to harmonize the opinions. Anyway, so lo me sheyipasku babayit. So the first thing they say is no, because this trimming takes place inside. And so, in fact, it's the same opinion. It's not a conflict. Or maybe it adds to the opinion. So the opinion is you tithe once you bring the produce inside the house. And maybe this Mar Zutra is just adding, it's yes, I agree with that in the house because we all agree. We love to agree, but I'm going to add one more provision. And then you trim it in the house. Okay, but of course that's absurd, right? I mean, because it really is just two conceptual approaches to it. Either you do it in the field or you do it in the house. You're not going to do that extra trimming in the house. It's something that likely would take place in the field. So ihachi mishi pasku. So if that's the case, then it wouldn't say from when you finish the work. It should say until you finish the work. That would be how it would be worded in the Mishnah that Mar Zutra is quoting from. So the difference is subtle, so subtle that I'm not sure I understand, and I'm not sure you'll understand. But I'll give it a go. So Meishi Pasku means so what he is saying, his opinion, Mar Zutra's opinion is that you don't tithe until the work is finished. No, you don't tithe. You tithe from when the work is finished, which implies that you would do it immediately. If the phrase was until the work is finished, that implies that the trimming we're talking about is the very last thing that happens. It happens inside, and then you still don't tithe until the work is finished. But the fact is, it says from when the work is finished, which means that the work could easily be finished in the field before it goes to the house, which proves that really they are two different opinions. Okay? Now we're going to go on with this. Itana aji pasku. But if it said until the work is finished, havi amina ad gamar lepiskayu. But if I said until the trimming is completed, if it had taught, actually this is just explaining what I just said. Itana aji pasku. If it said until the work is finished, I would think it's the very last step when it's finished. Kamash malan meishi pasku, but it teaches us from when it's finished. Miki achile pisikaya, which teaches us that it's not telling us that it's the very last step. It's telling us when you begin to complete the work. So when you begin to complete the work is that you trim it. That's the beginning of the completion of the work, right. And then the completion of the work is when you finally get it into the storehouse. And which teaches us this guy thinks that you tithe once you've begun to complete the work. All right, once it's out of the ground, it's heaped up, and then you're doing the little trimming that you're going to do. You're going to do that before you take it to the house. Then you tithe it. Okay. What does tithing mean at that point? You count it up and you separate 10%.
10%.
Yeah. So it means what you're bringing into the house is already tithed. It's already been tithed. Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm going to keep going. And it's continuing along the same lines. Mitiv, another objection that Mar Zutra raised. Mar Zutra is bringing these objections to Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yanai, who, if you remember, say that it all happens inside the house or inside the courtyard. So Mitiv Mar Zutra bereder Rav Nachman. So he was, by the way, his father was a rabbi. He's Mar Zutra, the son of Rav Nachman, but he was
the same Mar Zutra.
It's the same Mar Zutra, yeah, and obviously a tremendous disappointment to his father because he never took the ordination test. Yeah. And so he became a high-tech billionaire instead. He felt that would be a better use of his time, but
evaluations.
Right, but he was able to spend some of his spare time in the Talmudic arguments. Gornolam aser. Okay, so again, the time of tithing, they have the gathering time, but because remember that goren means the threshing floor, the gathering. L'chayev alav mishum tevel. L'chayev alav mishum tevel means that you're obligated. Tevel is untithed, so you're obligated to tithe. Meisha tigamer melachatan. It's when the work is finished. Okay, so before the Pascha was actually just talking about the trimming, which would be one thing you do for one particular crop, and they're extrapolating for all different crops. Now he phrases it slightly differently and says that tithing begins when the work ends. And you have to define what the work ends mean. Okay, now he defines it. The ezahu gamar melachatan, and what is the end of the work? Melechet hachnasatan. Bringing it in the sheaves, bringing it in. Now that goes back to, of course, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yanai's opinion, which is bringing in would be bringing it into the house or bringing it into the courtyard. If you flip the page, you'll see that's exactly their problem. My love, hachanasatan afilu basadeh. Oh, so it says that. So this actually unpacks the objection. So the bringing in could also take place in the field. So and you'll see Steinsaltz explains it's you could take it from one part of the field to another part of the field.
It's a
Yeah, where it's piled up, and then you have to do some stuff there. Get a cart, right. Go contract with some workers to come and pick it, but your pickers are just bringing it over there. It's unlikely that's what it means, but it could mean that. And then they answer, lo hachnasatan levite zeu gemar melachatan. They say, well, no, it seems likely that bringing it in, that hachnasatan is to bring it in, really seems to refer to someplace other than the field. They're right about that. Okay, so in that sense, it's not a conflict with Rabbi Yachal and Rabbi Yonai. But I'm going to keep going. V'ibait ema, but you could look at it slightly differently. That's what ibait ema means. If you want, we could read it this way. And this is the opinion, and this makes some sense. It could be that, in fact, these two sides agree, but there's two types of crops. Okay? When Rabbi Yonai said it becomes liable to tithe when it's brought into the courtyard, bizeitim va'anavim. So for olive or for grapes, and I said before that there's a big difference between olives, grapes, and wheat. There's a lot more you've got to do to wheat to finish so it could be for olives and for grapes, the end of the work is actually bringing it in. Because wash it, whatever you have to do, but there's not a whole mill, a whole milling process, a whole threshing process that you're going to use for.
Not edible until that process.
It's a good point. It's a good point. Except that you can imagine a store selling raw olives, right? I mean, it's just sure.
Fermented olives, maybe, but raw.
No, because then someone's gonna use them to make oil. I mean, the main thing they were doing with olives, I think, is not so much eating them, but they were using from their oil too. But it's a good point. But from their perspective, is it went straight from farm to store, or farm to
Table.
right. Okay. Delav b'nei goraninu. So those things are not threshing floor. That's where you get the literal translation of goran, which is threshing floor. You don't have the complicated process involved in harvesting grains that you have with grapes and with olives. So for them, there would be a different time. It actually makes some sense. There would be a different time to tithe. Okay. Aval chitinu sorin, but wheat and barley, goran behedya kativbe. Okay. So when it comes to barley and wheat, first of all, there is a logic that it's not liable to tithe yet because you don't know how much you're going to be using of it until it's actually in the threshing floor and maybe there's actual work done. But also, it so happens, the verse in the Torah which talks about tithing actually refers to grain and specifically refers to goren, has used the words goren, which is a threshing floor. So it makes sense that when we think of when we should tithe grain, that should be a frame of reference in the threshing floor itself. But we know that the Torah doesn't just mean grain when it comes to tithing. We know it means all produce. Actually, it means everything that's going to bring you income, which was largely produce in those days. But there's different types of produce, so there would be different rules. And finishing the work would mean something differently. So let's use grapes because it's easier. So grapes, you're just picking them off the vine, and then it would be different. So then you'd bring them to your house where the wholesaler would come and pick them up, as opposed to grain where there's a whole other process before it goes to market. Okay, is there a question? Yeah.
So two quick comments. One is you said that the government wants to tithe early so you have less losses. But
right.
I think you could argue the other way that the government wants to tithe late so that the government doesn't have to clean it up.
Yeah,
that's right. The government wants maybe to tithe late.
Yeah, they may.
What do you mean clean it up?
Trimming and.
We have to do.
Oh, I see. Oh, yeah, it'd be more valuable too. Yeah.
The government doesn't do
The other
it.
comment was
The bureaucrats just throw it out.
They just make money off of it.
with Mar Zuta, he said in the previous page, from the end of that work. It could be the same argument as the previous page.
Yeah, it is.
From the beginning of the
Yes, it could. Right.
I forgot that.
Yeah.
What about workers? Here, how do they tithe?
Well, we just we had a little bit about that too. So the workers don't have to tithe the food that they eat, and I don't think.
I don't mean that.
Yeah, so there's no income tax.
Yeah.
So it's not, they don't have to, and if they're getting cash, then they don't have to pay tax on it.
It's only the property owner.
Yeah, that's right.
The owner, you assume they want to pay, they should have money.
Yeah.
I think
Yes, I mean I think that they're assuming the workers are hand to mouth.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting. It's interesting that they even talked about this. My assumption. It'd be interesting to get some historians in here like Tom. I'm just like my assumption is that it would be absurd for the Torah or even the Talmud to imagine that workers would have enough money to pay tax.
Yeah.
That they would use it all, just for their daily needs. And I think it's a sign of a more sophisticated middle class economy that we would think of workers having to pay tax.
Would you call this progressive tithing?
Let me read a little bit more, and then page 185.
What's this term, B'nai Goren? B'nai means sons. Is it son?
Where are you seeing that?
B'nai Goren, threshing.
No, B'nai also means liable to. Yeah, B'nai, yeah. Attached to, liable to. It's a word that means a lot of things.
Oh.
Okay.
It's the same word?
It's the same word, yeah. Related to, yeah. Subject to, yeah. So it's obviously related. It's a related word. Okay. All right, 185. Changing this, I just wanted to start with this because it goes to what I talked about when in the beginning. Ashichan adam b'mechubar. We know that a human worker is allowed to eat produce that's attached to the ground or attached to a branch. You can pluck it and eat it. Okay, we've had that already. There's a verse in the Torah that tells us that. One of the reasons we know that is because it does say you're not allowed to use a scythe, like an implement to cut it off, but that implies you are allowed to pick it off the ground and eat it. Vishur betalush. We also know, again from a verse, that an animal is allowed to eat loose grain. Animals, by the way, do eat grain, right? I mean, they don't need it to be threshed and turned into bread. So animals are allowed to eat stuff that's loose. Okay. So how do we know that? That's interesting because actually, there's not a verse. The verse is that you're not allowed to muzzle your ox while you're plowing, or they used animals for threshing too, for stomping on things, and you're not allowed to muzzle the ox. So the likelihood is you're not allowed to muzzle the ox because you want to allow the ox to eat, right? So that teaches us that an ox is allowed to eat whatever the ox wants in the course of the work. But right now they're limiting that to stuff that's on the ground, it's falling on the ground, okay? And we also have a specific verse that seems to tell us that human beings are allowed to eat stuff that's plucked. What we don't have is the idea that human beings can eat stuff that's loose, just falling on the ground, or we don't have the idea that an animal is allowed to eat stuff that has to be plucked. We don't have that. So the question is, Adam b'talush minalan. How do we know? And actually implicit in the question is, do we know that a human being is also allowed to eat, the worker is allowed to eat stuff that's loose on the ground? Okay, so the next couple of weeks we're going to be delving into that. First of all, is that the case? Is that the case? Or is it the case that, do we limit it for a human being, a worker, just to stuff that you can pick? Or is it stuff that's also fallen on the ground? Now, logic would tell us that it seems to me yes, because suppose it's fallen on the ground, it's unlikely the farmer is going to use it. But it's going to get us into some interesting areas of how we care for our animals and the relationship between that and how we care for our workers.